hello again to my favorite viewers at number less than 5. So this week's article was actually really interesting and I never even heard of. Quite frankly, when I started reading the excerpt this week, which is from 2 consecutive chapters titled Twilight at Easter and the Last People Alive, from a book that I will get back to you on where I cited from, I had no idea where Polynesia was, east or west. I hadn't really thought much about it. It's down out where Hawaii is where the Polynesian islands are, but Hawaii is one of them. However, the author here wrote in an engaging and informative manner to make even details that generally are boring to me, such as the number of fish bones, the ratio of the number of fish bones in comparison to the number of porpoise bones found in one part of an island, to at least pass by smoothly. There were 2 significant points in each chapter that I felt tied together and were truly worth mentioning, and it's the causes of collapse for both Easter and the 2 islands, Pitcairn and Henderson. In Easter, there had been a time when there were thousands of people living on the island. Now, the island is an ecological wreck, practically a wasteland, no inhabitants, with no obvious to the untrained eye sign as to how many people could have possibly survived, The author puts forth the generally accepted hypothesis that the ecological disaster stemmed from a persistent denuding of the forest for the purpose of high culture. And let me explain that. This ties into why I have this goofy looking thing on my head. No, it's not because I forgot to take my towel off after a shower. It's because in Easter, the red clay and red feathers were rare and considered the sign of high class. So personally I like to be considered part of high class, so I thought I would give an example of the red headdress that chiefs and upper class civilians would wear. But the reason that they had to denude these forests is because they would make these incredible statues with a base, and these statues and the base combined could easily be 40 tons. Now keep in mind, we're talking about no later than 400 years ago, these people putting together and moving stones of tons. Not that this is unprecedented, like we know they did that in Egypt and in the pyramids and the Aztecs and other more well-known civilizations, but it's still remarkable. Even a crane could not move the heaviest of these statues. And so they had to, the way they most likely did it, is what scientists generally believe, is that they used wooden logs as rollers to move it along. And so in order to do that, there's hundreds of statues on the island. They had to cut down the forest so they could move the statues. And the statues were sort of the way that they measured. There were 12 different sort of sects, tribes, if you will, on Easter, and they would. The taller and more and heavier your statue was, the more status you had, the more bragging rights you would have. So obviously, chiefs found it very important. And they continued denuding the forest until there wasn't anything left. And when there's no food, nothing to keep your livelihood going, they killed all of their wildlife with the destroying of the ecological habitat. They ended up dying out because they're just. And granted, there were also other factors of Europeans coming and giving them and providing them with the lovely gift of epidemics of smallpox, etc. But really, they destroyed their ecological habitat. They couldn't live there. And there's one branch of Jewish thought would say that that's human right to do that. And the reason that they would say something that seems so ridiculous is that at the very beginning of the Torah, it says every day after the first 5 days after God's day of creation, he would say this, and this was good. And after he created man, he said, and this was very good. Which meant that mankind could had sovereignty over all of the rest of the earth, and therefore it was their right to do as they will for how they live their lives. And the other branch of thought is just in the very next chapter. It says that Adam and Eve were placed in custodian of the Garden of Eden to keep and stewardship. They were required to keep it well. And they would argue that, they had no right to do such a thing. However, there's also later on in when we see the Ten Commandments, and and later in the rabbinic interpretation, they say you must do anything you can to save a life. So if that meant that they had to cut down that tree to save that person's life, they had the right to. So really there's a conflicting sort of context that they had to work through. And it's really hard to say which one weighed the most in this case. They always say saving life trumps everything. However, if you're killing 30 lives by saving one, where's the balance? This also ties into, the Pitcairn and Henderson. Pitcairn and Henderson lasted longer, even though they had even less resources than Easter, because they had trade going between them two and a third island that begins with an F. And the three islands together, they traded so they would have a balance of resources. However, eventually the trading died out. They stopped. They weren't trading with each other. They weren't doing what they had to do, and when they were stuck with the limited resources of their islands, their populations couldn't support them. The population died down, and to such a limited population that there is today, and it's presumed because their ecology could not support themselves. They weren't using it. It wasn't even an issue of them saving ecology. They just didn't have a way to do it. So, but it really demonstrated the importance of trade and how trade can really make it's important. But they traded. They would be on the water for 5 days to get from island to island just so that they could get the right kind of oyster shells. It's so interesting. Like we take it for granted that you can travel across seas and trade, but keep in mind that they're doing this in these little canoes. Granted, they're quality canoes. Don't get me wrong, but they're still, how do they do it? And they started dying out when they stopped working together and they stopped trading. And what that reminds me of is not only the taking care of your ecology, but also the 10 lost tribes of Israel. How in Israel they sort of split up, and the land was divided amongst the 12 tribes, sort of like the way it was in Easter actually. But then 10 of them disappeared, and we don't know what happened to them. We have no idea. And it's not really a surprise when when everything's going against you, how you might lose an entire people. And so at least Judaism can appreciate why it is that an entire people could be lost just for an ecological breakdown. I mean, look at the way Palestine is now. It was 80 years ago, it was desert, you couldn't live there. And people changed it so they could, but they had the technology to do so. So on that note, East Polynesia, pretty cool history. I'm out.